Hello, it's been a bit of a while for me. I've been fairly busy. So, this is the start of a new series I've titled A Sociologist Now. It's all about why your course is relevant to everything that's happening in the world and how we can apply it and the questions we can ask and the observations and the links that we can make. I say series and I've called it part one optimistically because I hope I have time to do this regularly, or at least semi-regularly. Or maybe you'll leave YouTube comments and ask me questions, or you'll just need me to go over stuff. Either way, let's see how we go with this first one and get right into it. Some of the things we're going to cover today I've titled Feminism in Manchester. We're going to look at gender in education, overrepresentation and power, and McDonald's around the world. Now, these could link to any of the topics on the GCSE or just in sociology in general, and could massively overlap. So throughout, be thinking about what would a functionalist say, a feminist say, a Marxist say. How would it link to concepts that you know about, like meritocracy or the nuclear family or whatever else it might be, crime and deviance, education. Don't try and pigeonhole it into just one topic necessarily, but that's what we're going to look at. So let's get right into it. Now, I happened to go into Manchester city centre on this weekend, and as I got off the tram, the very first thing that greeted me, once I checked where my children were, was this statue of a very famous suffragette who is from Manchester. And right opposite it was this protest starting. Now, this was a national protest that I hadn't really heard of. I'd heard of the campaign group behind it called Pregnant and Then Screwed, and this was about childcare and the cost of childcare in the UK. So I thought that was a really weird kind of coincidence that you have this statue of a historical fight for women's rights happening. Right next to it is the town hall being sort of overtaken by a current one, a very, very current one. And this was happening all around cities. Now, if you know your history, you know the suffragettes, they weren't just deviant in the academic sense. They committed crimes by the standards of the day. They were put in prison, they were force-fed in prison. They did all sorts of things which you can link to crime and deviance, all to do with women's rights and power and equality, but also to do with roles in the family too. And the fact that in 2022 you've now got this, what we'd call it, a civil protest, if you like, or a march with placards, with slogans. There was a poetry reading going on, and it was people of all different races, presumably of different classes. I mean, it's hard to tell in 2022, isn't it? And they're all protesting and fighting for fairer treatment of women in the workforce, and the idea that women are dropping out of the workforce because childcare is so expensive. So you can obviously link that to the history and the feminism that we study, but also from a functionalist perspective, these people were peacefully protesting and demonstrating. They were listening to speakers and to people talking about an issue, and they were holding up placards, and it was involving the whole family. So you could think about the safety valve analogy and leveraging change in society. Think about the role in the nuclear family and the idea of dual career families and who earns what and who does what, and unpaid labour. And again, you know, women having the right to vote for so long, and sort of more equality in the democracy of this country. Is it changing enough? Is it changing enough in society, and what does that mean? So there's lots of debates there to pick out, and things that happen in our society all the time. You can link back to some of these studies that we look at. Building on what we've just talked about, The Sociology Show just tweeted this out, and it was all about how teachers mark girls' work more favourably. And I thought about my own practice immediately and whether I do this or not, and I don't think I do, but then I'm going to say that, aren't I? Maybe I do. Maybe there's other complex reasons: engagement in class, the fact that I teach a subject that's overwhelmingly a girl's subject, as a gendered subject, both in terms of uptake at A level and beyond. So there's lots of issues to unpack there, and whether teachers label students by gender. what does that mean for race and ethnicity and culture and background and all the other sort of clumsy labels we might want to stick onto pupils and onto teachers. You know, supposedly teachers are overwhelmingly middle class. Traditionally they are anyway. I don't know what the demographic is like in today's age. But functionalists obviously talking about society in miniature, you may want to question, well then, why have we just talked about women protesting and being undervalued in society and the feminist arguments about unpaid labour? And think about how you guys kind of interact with each other at school and the stereotypes around what it means to be male or female in a classroom and in a school space, how that reflects how you work, for example, and what you do and what you want to be seen to be doing. So there's lots of things from education that then feed into your later life, obviously, and everyone's later life. So this tweet here makes a lovely contrast with what we've just talked about. So think about why that might be. Now we've had yet another Prime Minister, another government reshuffle, if you like, and this overrepresentation and power is a really interesting idea. The Conservative government, certainly in terms of its social media presence, supporters of the Conservative government, I should say, have been very quick to point out that Rishi Sunak is our first South Asian's first Hindu Prime Minister. But he's also from an incredibly wealthy background and privately educated. And this is something that critics have looked at too. And it's a really interesting insight into how we define other people and what we look for. So you can highlight both aspects of the Prime Minister and his cabinet and his government and the previous governments. And overwhelmingly, about 7% of the population attend private school. Yet they are hugely overrepresented in all governments, historically speaking too, and particularly from Oxford and Cambridge University. So you can see 65% of the cabinet attended private school. That's hugely overrepresentative of 7% of the UK population. So if you think about your research methods and sampling and representation, it's really key. Rishi Sunak may represent a huge change in one aspect of his identity, but in another, some people are arguing, well, he's no different. I mean, we want to think about what does that mean? All political bias aside, from an education point of view, and as students who will study at Sociology of Education, it's really interesting that the richest families have kids that end up in the most powerful jobs. And think about Weber and all of the different types of power that he talks about, you know, your rational and your traditional, combine that with education and what we know about that. It makes for a really interesting juxtaposition with the things we've talked about in terms of family too. Now, the Sutton Trust, who are brilliant for lots of different research, if ever you need to find something to back up a point you want to make, the Sutton Trust aren't a bad place to go. From Clement Attlee in 1945 right through to Rishi Sunak today, you can see how the changes in private education in the cabinet happen. Now, red represents Labour governments, blue represents Conservative governments, broadly speaking. You can see that traditionally the Conservative governments massively favour privately educated cabinet ministers, or massively employ privately educated cabinet ministers. Politically, you could explain that as simply the idea that Labour are seen as the party of the working class and the Conservatives of the bourgeoisie, to borrow a Marxist term. It's more complicated than that, and it's perhaps not the binary split that Marx would always have it. But regardless, it does show a clear trend, and even the lowest percentage, Clement Attlee in 1945, is nowhere near that 7% of private education that we have now, 3 times as many and more. So if you think about power and you think about wealth and you think about cultural capital and all those concepts that link together, why is it that privately educated pupils end up running the country? Because essentially this is what this graph shows us, and to different amounts depending on which party wins an election. Now, should Labour win the next general election, What the percentage will be, who knows? But it'll be very interesting to see if it drops again, stays the same, or if there's been a massive shift in British population at all in any way. But when we talk about diversity and we talk about representation, the government is a good control measure to look at, because it's a good comparison in some ways. Do they really represent the people that elect them? And if they don't, what does that say about the political system and the power in the country? So think about all of the different issues we've raised so far and where that comes in. Now, lastly, I found this really funny little infographic about when McDonald's opened in different countries. Because if you think about capitalism and you think about globalism and globalization, the spread of a fast food outlet and a franchising fast food outlet like a McDonald's is a really interesting indicator for capitalism. So you can see that really there's an east-west split in Europe. Now, for those of you that know about communism and the USSR and Russia, you can see many of those former communist countries received their McDonald's sort of as communism fell, really in the early 90s, whereas McDonald's had been well established in Britain in the 70s, Germany too, and before that. Whereas someone like Italy, which is very famous for its cuisine, and France, there's a nice contrast to that. France adopted them earlier, Italy took much later. So you can think about culture, you can think about what that shows us about people, even about the capitalist system too, and why McDonald's might represent not just America, and if you think about Robert Merton and his ideas, but what it might represent capitalism, and what it might represent the idea of everything that Marx kind of rallied against. But I think when you're on social media, obviously question every source, but you can make observations based on sources like this really, really easily and ask yourself, well, what does it tell me about the stuff that I've learned? Because if we go right back to the start, you know, taking your kids to McDonald's and pester power and all the other things we've talked about links nicely back to the family, links nicely back to class, links nicely back to all these other issues. So hopefully you can see today all the stuff that's been going on in the world, all the stuff that kind of happens, and there's way more that I just haven't got the scope to cover today, but will do in the future. You can always apply your sociology to it, and you can always find ways to make it current and make it up to date and compare. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's given you some food for thought. If you've got questions, please leave them in the comments. I really enjoy reading your comments, particularly, you know, when they're positive. But hopefully you can start to see why we do this and what it means.